There is a legend about the singer-songwriter Johnny Cash and how he got his big break. Before anybody knew who Johnny Cash was, he was living in Memphis, working as an appliance salesman, raising a family, and trying to find a way to break into the music industry with what today we would call a garage band. But one day, Cash and his band had an opportunity to audition in front of legendary producer Sam Phillips. And so they hurried, they gathered up their instruments, they went down to the studio, and they began to play their favorite kind of music, the music they loved and knew the best, old-timey gospel hymns. A few minutes into the audition, Phillips interrupts them, and he says he doesn't believe it. Or maybe more importantly, he doesn't believe that they believe what they're singing about the peace of Jesus, the sweetness of the gospel. Because their singing and their playing is lifeless, it's stale, it's boring. And then Philip says something along the lines of, "Go home and sin some, and then come back to me and sing about grace." Now, in all fairness, Cash later in his life denied that Phillips ever said those words, and there's other versions of the story floating out there as well, but whether it's true word for word or even happened at all, the point still stands. It's in the face of sin and evil and darkness that the light shines the most brightly. It's only when we see the depths of our own sin and evil that we come to find the even greater depths that Jesus will go to deliver us from that evil, from the evil without, and maybe most especially the evil within. And so this Lent, we're taking a close look at evil. Specifically, we're looking at how evil is portrayed in Luke's Passion narrative in chapters 22 and 23 of his gospel, and we'll be asking questions like, what is evil? Who does evil? How does evil come against Jesus? And how does he respond in the face of it? I suppose that really is the question, isn't it? How does Jesus respond to evil? Because for millennia, people have been trying to wrestle with this question of evil, trying to understand it somehow, to make sense of all of the bad things, all of the evil that we see in the world around us. And yet, if you were with us Wednesday, you heard this quote from Dr. Kolb. Instead of an answer to evil, God offers a person. God doesn't answer all of our questions about evil. He doesn't give us a simple solution, a philosophy, a framework to understand it, probably knowing that if he did, we'd be tempted to try to manage and control evil on our own. But instead, God gives us a person. So today, and throughout this Lent, we're going to focus on that person. We're going to ask, how does Jesus respond to evil? How did he respond to evil then? How does he respond to the evil in us and around us now? Luke sets the scene for us in 3 short vignettes. This is the first one here on the screens, verses 1 and 2 from our reading. I invite you to read along with me. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. In the first scene Luke gives us, the chief priests, the scribes, are seeking a way to kill Jesus. The chief priests were made up of a group within first century Judaism known as the Sadducees. The scribes, on the other hand, were part of another group known as the Pharisees. You may have heard of these two groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But what you might not know is that these were rival groups. They didn't always get along. They saw the issues very differently. Religion, politics, you could even call them enemies within the sphere of first century Judaism. And it's amazing how often a common foe can bring enemies together. And so Luke tells us that the chief priests and the scribes, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, together decided that Jesus must be eliminated. We learn from other Gospels that they had already decided that Jesus was a threat to the nation, a threat to themselves, to their person, to their position of power and prestige within the people. It wasn't a question of if anymore. Jesus had to go. The only question was how. Because by now, Jesus was very popular with the crowd, with the people. Just a few days before, an impromptu parade had broken out as he came into Jerusalem. The chief priests and the scribes knew that they couldn't make a move against Jesus publicly. They feared what the crowd might do. And so instead, they sat back, they bided their time, watching, waiting, seeking. Evil was seeking an opportunity to destroy Jesus. The plot continues to unfold. In the next scene that Luke gives us, we read again together. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray Jesus to them. So Judas consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. The introduction of Satan at this point in the narrative is unique to Luke as we kind of get a glimpse of the evil behind Judas's actions. We're not given any other motivation for why Judas decided to betray Jesus. Luke simply says that Judas approached the chief priests, the temple officials, and they came to an agreement. And it was pretty straightforward. Judas would receive money, and the chief priests would get the thing that they had been seeking, an opportunity to get Jesus away from the rest of the crowd. Another apparent win-win agreement between people you wouldn't normally see as cooperating. Luke tells us they were glad. Think about that for a minute. They were glad that they had an opportunity to kill someone. And now Judas is part of the plot. Now Judas, one of the 12, is also seeking. Evil is seeking an opportunity to get Jesus alone. And then we come to the final scene, the one that will really drive the action over the next couple of chapters. Jesus sends Peter and John on ahead of him and the other disciples to go and prepare the Passover. 5 times in this short chapter, Luke makes sure that we understand that everything is now prepared, that everything is ready. Jesus says, go and prepare the Passover. The disciples ask, where shall we prepare it? Jesus says, a large room, furnished, means it's ready to go. Go and prepare there. And the disciples went and prepared the Passover. Ready. Prepared. Jesus even gives Peter and John a signal, something to look for. He says, look for a man carrying a jar of water. He will lead you to the location. It's a curious detail. In first century Jerusalem, men did not carry jars of water. It would have been conspicuous. It would have stood out, an obvious sign to Peter and John as to who they were supposed to follow. And we might wonder, is this an example of Jesus' divinity, of him being able to see into the future, to know what's going to happen ahead of time? It certainly could be. Jesus had the ability to do that. He demonstrated that power many times before. But there also might be a simpler explanation, that it had all been prearranged, that Jesus had set it up beforehand, that the man carrying the jar of water was a tip, a clue to Peter and John as to which person to follow. Luke doesn't tell us which one it was. But whether it was the sign, the owner, the house, the furnished room, whether all of that was prescient or planned, it really doesn't make a difference. The upshot is that Jesus is a step ahead of his enemies. That the chief priests and the scribes and Judas and even Satan himself are sitting back and watching and waiting, seeking the opportunity. And while they're sitting back, Jesus is acting. He's on the move. And we see the result here in the final verse. We read again once more. They went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. Just as he had told them. The Passover is the backdrop for everything that will happen in this chapter and in the chapters to come. It's the very first verse from our reading. It's in the very last verse from our reading, and all throughout. We heard about the institution of the Passover, the very first Passover in Egypt in our Old Testament reading. And there's a whole lot that we could say about the Passover. We could probably do an entire sermon series on just the Passover, its significance and unique position in the history of God's people. But for today, we'll just say this. The Passover was a time when God's people remembered. They remembered a time when they had been under the thumb of a very real, a very visceral, a very raw type of evil. A time when they had been slaves in Egypt, when their lives and bodies were not their own, when their children were murdered in mass. They remembered a period of 400 years, nearly twice the history of this country. 400 years when evil had been done to them in normal, everyday sorts of ways, and horrific and brutal sorts of ways. Passover was a time for God's people to remember the evil they had endured, and also to remember the God who delivered them from that evil. How Yahweh God had come down with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and struck Pharaoh and all of his servants with plagues. How he had loosed the angel of death on the firstborn of Egypt. And when Pharaoh and his chariots pursued the children of Israel to overtake them and enslave them once again, God drowned them in the Red Sea. And yet God's people passed through from death to life on dry ground. At Passover, God's people remembered the God who heard their cries, who saw their suffering, the God who was prepared and ready to go to battle on behalf of his people and deliver them from evil. And now it's Passover again. And again, God's people are enslaved. Evil has deceived even their priests, even the scribes, even Jesus' closest allies, and turned them against him. Evil is coming for Jesus, seeking him out. And yet, once again, God is prepared. Jesus is prepared, even inviting the attack, almost like a boxer leaning back against the ropes, goading his opponent to waste his punches. Jesus is a step ahead of his opponents, even creating the opportunity that evil had been looking for as he goes off alone with his disciples, away from the crowd. It's exactly what the scribes and the priests and Judas had been waiting for. And Jesus instigates all of it. And you might wonder why. Why would he do something like that? Why would he separate himself from the crowd? Why would he create the very opportunity, make himself vulnerable to this plot? Because the hour has come. And Jesus is prepared. Everything that's about to happen is just as he said it would be. And just as for a time God's people in Egypt had evil done to them, so too for a time, evil will do its worst to Jesus. For a time, it will look as though Satan and sin have the upper hand. For a time, it will look as though death had won. Jesus will be betrayed and beaten. He will be mocked and killed. On the cross, he will endure the worst that evil can dish out, take it into his own body. And yet he is prepared to face all of this because he knows and trusts the Father. He knows and trusts that very soon the Father will raise him up from the dead and give him a victory over sin and death and evil that will never pass away. A victory that's yours through faith in this Jesus. And so if you remember nothing else from this sermon, if you remember nothing else from today, I want you to remember this, that Jesus is prepared to face and defeat evil for you. And yet evil still exists. There's still evil in our world. It's not an illusion. It's not a figment of our imaginations. Evil is very real and raw and so often intensely personal. There's still evil in the world and evil in our own lives. If we define evil as anything and everything opposed to God's will, every one of us is guilty. Guilty of doing evil, of being complicit in it, of being taken away, carried up in it. Evil seeks to ensnare and entrap. It takes the very best things, the very best gifts of God, and turns them into the very worst. It's always near, always present, seeking to steal and to kill and destroy. That's what evil is. That's what evil does. And yet when you are confronted with evil, when evil seeks you out, remember that Jesus is not surprised by it. He's not caught off guard. He's not clueless. Jesus wasn't surprised by evil then. He's not surprised by evil in the world or in us now. He's prepared. And so when you see images of war on your screen and you wonder, how can this possibly be happening again? Remember that Jesus is prepared. When you hear of suffering around the world, famines and pandemics and disasters and trafficking and oppression, and the list goes on and on and on, remember that Jesus is not clueless. He's not oblivious to evil and to suffering. He's prepared. When you receive a diagnosis that you had feared, when your home is shattered by addiction or abuse or anger or abandonment, remember that Jesus is ready. And when you are confronted with evil, the evil of your past, evil that has been done to you, evil that you've done to others, when you're confronted with evil now, when you're enticed to come, let us make an agreement together to turn your back on your Lord. Remember, Jesus isn't surprised. He's not repulsed by you, the evil you've done or that has been done to you. But instead, he walks towards it. He walks into the evil because he is prepared. Jesus is prepared to face and defeat evil for you. In his name, amen.